Welcome to What Really Matters podcast, Everyday Spirituality with Karen Wyatt. Thanks so much for joining me here today. This is episode number 153, and I'm going to be talking about when grief comes back like a volcano, the second wave. And before I get there, I just wanted to make a quick announcement that my new book, Wild and Holy, The Journey of Grief, Guilt, and Grace in Italy, is launching on Kickstarter on October the 1st. And so that's just a couple of days after this episode airs. And for some of you, it may already have launched. But I hope you'll check out my Kickstarter in case you'd like to get an advance copy of this book. You can get either ebook, paperback, or hardcover. The ebooks will come out immediately. They'll be delivered as soon as the Kickstarter ends. The campaign ends in 3 weeks. And the print books will come a little bit later. I need time to order them and get them all signed for you and in the mail. So I'm very excited about this book. And the subject of today's conversation is this book, Wild and Holy. It's talking about the second wave of grief, which is what I experienced during the travel that I'm describing in the book, but again, a third wave of it, I guess, as I was writing the book. So I hope that you'll check that out. The Kickstarter campaign you can find at tinyurl.com/wildandholy with no punctuation and no spaces, tinyurl.com/wildandholy. So I hope you'll go there and check it out. Support the Kickstarter campaign if you feel so inclined, and if you'd like to get an earlier look at this book than other people will who wait for it to go on sale. So I'll move on now with my topic this week, and it's talking about the second wave of grief, which for me came back like a volcano that had been dormant for years and years. And I'm even thinking of Vesuvius when we traveled there in Italy, which is written about in the book, but how long that volcano had lain dormant, so that the people living near the volcano at the time of the eruption that buried Pompeii and Herculaneum, they did not even know that Vesuvius was a volcano. They were not aware of that. It was just a mountain to them. And so even the legends and stories of it having erupted centuries before had been lost to the people. They were not aware that it was a volcano. And sometimes, for me at least, when my second wave of grief came back, it was like a volcano I hadn't recognized. I didn't know I was carrying a volcano inside of me that was capable of erupting again and causing damage. And it wasn't until much later that I learned this is called the second wave of grief. And all of it started to make sense to me the more I learned about it and read about the second wave of grief. And so I'll tell you a little bit more about this in my case. So for me, my father had died by suicide when I was in my 30s, and I was a brand new doctor working in family medicine. I was a mom. I had a 2-year-old and a 4-month-old. So very tiny little babies that I was caring for, and really just barely, still postpartum and just barely getting back to work in my very full family practice clinic. And as some of you may have heard me tell the story before, it was my response, my deep, deep grief after learning the news of my father's suicide that ultimately led me to start working in hospice care, because I felt like I needed to understand death and dying and grief better. I started volunteering in hospice. I ended up making that my career path to be a hospice medical director, and which I did for years and years. Now, the irony is, when the second wave of grief came back to me, it was 20 years after my dad died, exactly 20 years later, that the second wave of grief came back. And at that time, I was back working in family medicine, even though I had spent nearly all of those 20 years doing hospice care. We had moved to a small resort community in the mountains in Colorado. There was a hospice there, but they didn't have a paying job for me. So I had to get a job again as a family practice doctor, which I hadn't done since the very early years when my dad first died. So I was taken all the way back to sort of reliving my earlier career and reliving those years in a way, the same thing I was doing at the time of my father's death. So there I was in Colorado working once again as a family medicine doctor when the second wave came back to me. And the story is the second wave came back as we were leaving on a trip. It was our second honeymoon to Italy. Our children had left home and we were empty nesters. We'd moved into a new house that for just the two of us, leaving behind the family home where our kids had been raised for the last several years. And we were kind of starting life over again in a way as empty nesters on our second honeymoon. And what happened, just briefly, the whole story is in the book, but a young patient of mine died in my family practice office the morning we were leaving on our trip. And the volcano inside of me erupted. And I was struck with, once again, the deepest, most devastating, crippling grief that I could imagine. And I had no idea at the time why it was so severe. I didn't really think I'd only met this patient one time before he died. I couldn't imagine that was creating such a huge grief response in me. I was very confused by it initially until I realized that it was actually old grief over my father's suicide that was coming to the surface, and the death of this boy from my clinic was opening that old volcano of stored grief that was deep inside of me to erupt once again. And as I looked at this, it made sense to me that a large amount of the grief that came upon me right after my father's death ended up getting buried because, as I described, I was young. I was in my early 30s. I had two little babies at home to take care of, a full medical practice. I was a wife and homemaker as well. I simply did not have the time, the energy, or the bandwidth to fully grieve my father's devastating suicide death. And Francis Weller wrote that suicide really tears at the very fabric of the psyche when you lose a loved one to suicide. And it's one of the most devastating types of grief there is, and it can take years to heal. So looking back, I understand now, because of my life situation, I had no time or space to fall apart in my grief and to go on a really deep internal journey of grief over my dad's death. I simply had to compartmentalize a huge amount of that pain and suffering just to get through day to day, being a mom to two little babies, and then going to my family practice office and working with patients and helping them. It was truly overwhelming. There was no way that I could fully, deeply grieve my dad's death in the moment at that time. And what we've learned about this second wave grief when it comes back again after a time is that oftentimes it comes when some sort of protective layer that's been protecting us from the grief that's been stored fades away or begins to disappear. But it also comes with a certain timing when you have the space and the bandwidth and the energy and the time to process the grief finally at last. And so for me, unbelievably, it took 20 years for that volcano to erupt again, for all of that grief to come back to me a second time. And it was shocking to me. And frankly, I felt embarrassed. I felt almost guilty that I was still grieving this deeply after such a long time. I realized that comes from our society's push to get through grief and get over grief and to do it within a certain time frame. And I understand it was added to by comments I heard from other people who said, I can't believe you're still even feeling anything about that. What? You're still processing that after all this time? What have you been doing? How could that still be bothering you? I heard that from other people in my life. And of course, that's the attitude in our society, that grief should be dealt with, over and done with as quickly as possible. That there's no sense in wasting your time grieving someone who's gone. You just need to move on with your life. And that is kind of the value we have held for a very long time in our society that I hope is beginning to change now. But Shelby Forsythia has written in a blog post about the second wave of grief, and this is actually one of the things that really helped me recently to actually forgive myself for experiencing this deep wave of grief when we were leaving on our trip to Italy. And Shelby wrote, especially in sudden or unexpected deaths, we process what we can handle in the first go-round, and we process the rest later. Our brains process what's left of our grief, whether it's 2 weeks, 2 months, 2 years, or 2 decades after the death occurred. For me, it was exactly 2 decades when my volcano of second wave grief erupted. And it wasn't until I read that in Shelby's blog post that I felt like, oh, it's okay. I can forgive myself. I can get over feeling bad or feeling guilty that my grief took such a long time to process. It wasn't that I was doing it wrong. It's that I simply wasn't ready to hold all that was encased in this bundle of grief that had been stored so deeply inside of me. And the interesting thing is, another thing that I actually felt guilty about is that during all the years I worked in hospice, I spent so much time sitting with other people who were grieving and listening to stories, talking to people, watching them. And during that time, I felt like I really was healing my own grief. In fact, as the years went on that I worked in hospice, I felt better and better about my grief. I felt like I'm carrying this so well now. I feel so healed as far as grief goes now. I've done all this work. I've processed so much, and I'm carrying it so well now. Isn't that amazing that I was able to heal from this traumatic suicide death of my father? And I think that's another reason I felt embarrassed and even ashamed that this second wave of grief pulled me under so badly, buried me in lava and ashes like the volcano. And I was completely shocked by it. I wasn't expecting that to happen at all. I hadn't even imagined that could be possible, that it would come back again. But the thing is, I was dealing with grief. I was dealing with portions of my grief all those years when I worked in hospice. I was processing it, but I was processing little bits and pieces of it as I could, as I was ready, as I had the bandwidth, as I had the strength and the insight to hold those bits of my grief. But what was left over deep inside for me that came up in that second volcanic wave for me was grief that was deeply entangled with guilt. And I think for many people that may be true as well for others who have guilt come back after a number of years, that there may have been deep guilt that was all entangled and wrapped up in part of the grief experience. All of it got buried together because the guilt itself is so unthinkable and unbearable to face. It's almost impossible for the ego to manage the depth of guilt, and especially after a suicide death. And I read that there's also guilt about feeling guilty, and I clearly had all of that. I've carried all of that all of my life. And for me, I had grief from old family dynamics that had been part of our family relationship for my entire life that I was still carrying. I had guilt from being a medical doctor and from other times when I felt like I had let patients down or been a failure. And that happened in spades when my own father died. And I felt like, here I am, a family doctor. I've been trained in behavioral health. I did a 1-year fellowship in psychiatry. I've worked with people who are suicidal and depressed before, and I was not able to save my own father. The guilt from that was so unbearable. I could not stand to look at it and contemplate it and actually hold it out in the open. And then the unknowns in general of Dad's experience and of his choices to end his life and why he made the choice and what was happening for him. Why didn't I know more about him and what he was experiencing? And as his daughter, why couldn't my love for him be enough for him to hold on to want to stay alive for? That was another sense of guilt that I was carrying. So there were layers and layers of guilt all tangled up also with the grief. But the guilt itself was just so hard to bear and to carry. The thought that I could have had anything to do with my father's death, anything I did or said or didn't do or didn't think of, or anything for my entire life that could have contributed to my father's mental health and the situation that he was in at the end of his life. All of those things came crashing down on me at once. And a significant part of that guilt, as I already alluded to, was the guilt that people in medical professions and healing professions can feel when they are unable to save a life. We carry this deep responsibility for other people's lives as part of our profession. And when things don't work out the way we hoped and we're not able to save a life, that healer's guilt is intense and very, very deep. And that's partly what I was experiencing as well. And I think that aspect was what I found so challenging to look at. And that's why when the boy in my medical practice died, it brought up that specific guilt of being a medical practitioner responsible for someone's life and having things not turn out the way we expected or hoped or wanted. I felt ashamed as a doctor that my patient had died, and I felt ashamed as a doctor and a daughter that my father had died 20 years earlier. And the combination of all those levels of guilt and shame tangled up with my grief made the initial grief wave of my grief over my father's death get buried deep inside. And then the reenactment with my young patient dying just brought all of it to the surface. And that's why it was such a challenge for me and such a huge load to try to carry. And all of it, again, it came to the surface as we were leaving on this trip to Italy, which I considered canceling, but ended up going on for my husband's sake because he was looking forward to it. I didn't want to deprive him of it or take this trip away from him. I wanted to make it the best possible trip it could be for him as well. So what we know is that time does not heal grief, and grief remains. It's something that we carry with us all of our lives. It's actually how we carry it. For me, carrying it for 20 years, buried deep inside of me, was probably a survival mechanism. It probably kept me going in those early years, but it wasn't healthy for me. It wasn't something I could sustain, and that's why the second wave was really important, an important occurrence for the grief to be released along with the guilt so that I could begin to look at it. And what happened after that trip to Italy over the years, and as I continued to process it, and then the ideas for writing this book began to come to me, I started reliving it. I started releasing even more of it and having it come to the surface, and really writing the book Wild and Holy was the ultimate climax of that book. And in the process of writing, particularly certain chapters of the book, I had a great deal of deeper grief come back to me as I was writing. So still more remnants that had been stored inside probably contributed to my heart disease on the spiritual, emotional level. And it was indeed a very healing experience for me, body, mind, and spirit, to write the book, to bring it all again to the surface, to relook at it, and to actually do some somatic therapy that could help me heal what had been really carried in the cells of my body, deep, deep in my bones, my blood, my very cells in my DNA. I was finally able to get to the pain and work that through as I wrote this book. And so looking at it, it took so many years for all of this to come to the surface. I have no idea if it's all there yet. I have no idea how much more I still have to work on. And will it come back to me again in a fourth wave or fifth wave of grief? Probably. But I wanted to share this because I imagine that there are a lot of other people out there experiencing second waves of grief, and sometimes maybe many years, like for me, after the initial death occurred, and perhaps wondering, like, what is wrong with me that I'm this devastated and this broken up over this death. And I wanted to share the story so that other people would recognize that it's actually normal. And the reason we don't feel all of that pain in the beginning is simply because we're not strong enough to, for whatever reason. The timing isn't quite right. And it comes back to us when we're ready, when we're able to look at it, able to carry it, able to bear it. And in spite of the fact that our society still puts huge pressure on us to get over grief early, and also adds to our own shame when we relive grief, and especially if it's years later, other people don't understand that. It doesn't make any sense to them. Like, how have you not moved on from that and gotten over it? But the fact is, we don't get over it. We simply learn how to carry it better. We learn how to embody the grief, the guilt, the pain, and make it part of our conscious being so that it's out in the open. We could carry it more gracefully, more beautifully, and it becomes part of who we are and how we show ourselves to the rest of the world. That's still what I'm working on. I'm talking about it because it's the first time I've been able to talk so honestly and so openly about my experience, particularly with the guilt aspect of grief. And I totally understand if you are experiencing a second wave of grief, anyone who happens to listen, that it's actually really hard to describe to other people what's happening. It doesn't fully make sense when it comes over you, even to your own rational mind. You can't quite believe that, seriously, this is related to that death that happened so long ago. Why would I be feeling this now? I've lived all these years and I haven't gone through this. Like, why is it coming up now? But I do encourage you to really think about it. Think of it as a second wave of grief and start to process it by journaling about it, writing down some of your thoughts and some of your emotions, and asking, like, I wonder why this is coming up now. What is allowing this pain to come back to me now? And what is it that I'm ready to heal now that's ready to come to the surface? Journal about that. But also, one thing I did was write letters to my father and write letters to myself, the grieving mom with 2 babies who was struggling just to get through every day, even without having to process this deep, intense, devastating grief. And writing letters to myself at each stage along the journey, different points where I could look back and see what I was working on. Even writing a letter to myself as a hospice doctor, helping other people with their grief, and learning so much about grief and feeling really, really free and released in some way from parts of the grief that I had carried for a long time after working through it. And yet I needed to show compassion to that self of me, that past self of me, who I now look at as somewhat naive, who just didn't know. You don't even know there's a whole volcano of grief and guilt still being carried inside of you. And you think you're done. You think you've processed all of this and you're nowhere near that point yet. So I had to show compassion for those earlier manifestations of me and how I navigated the grief at that time, because I was doing the best I could for the situation that I was in. And I'm sure that's true for you as well. If you look back, you will see you did what you could. You handled what you could. So recognize whatever grief is still there that wasn't carried before, but also have compassion and forgiveness for the you that wasn't able to handle the grief at that time. And have love for the you that is now re-experiencing it because you're ready and because you are strong enough to carry it. Resist the temptation to feel embarrassed or ashamed or to apologize to anyone that you're still experiencing grief from a few decades ago, because it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks. If they don't understand it, it's because they've never experienced it before. But give yourself permission to feel whatever you feel, the whole breadth of emotion and the depth of emotion, whatever it is. Don't judge it. Allow it to be there and just love yourself through it. And also recognize that some of this grief and guilt pain is stored in the physical body itself. So as much as we love our cognitive therapy and processing through journaling, it's really important to work through the physical body and to express the pain through motion and through physical activity. So somatic yoga, that's one thing I've been practicing. I've been doing healing dance work, listening to spiritual music and doing healing dance, but also walking, running, cycling, aerobic exercise, if you can tie it together with, I'm doing this exercise as a release to let go of some of the emotion that's been stored in my body. Sometimes a massage can be really helpful, and to deep tissue massage that helps you release pain that's being stored in the physical body. And for me, that was a missing piece. I had not worked in depth on the somatic pain that I was carrying until this past year as I was writing the book. And I really recommend it. I feel like that unlocked a huge amount of stored guilt and grief for me. And maybe if your grief is returning after a lot of years, experience some gratitude for one, that you're having this opportunity to continue to process more deeply, that you loved someone so much that you have carried this grief deep inside of you, the grief that was the other side of the love that you felt for them. You've carried all of this time, and you're now ready finally to address it and to carry it out in the open along with your love for the person who has died. And have gratitude for yourself, for your own strength and your courage, that you could get this far, that you've carried it for so long, and that now you're at a place where it's returning to you because you're ready. You're ready to deal with it. You're not the same person you were when your loved one died. You're someone new now and someone different, and you're ready to blossom and bloom even more by doing deeper work, layered work, somatic work, and releasing what's been hidden in the darkness into the light so that you can carry it with you more openly. So I encourage you to be gentle with yourself, but don't shy away from going into this grief and facing it directly and accepting it into your life, because it's very important, and it will help you grow in ways you cannot even imagine. And I'll mention again, my book, Wild and Holy, is coming out. It's launching on Kickstarter. That's the first place you'll be able to get a hold of it. You can go to tinyurl.com/wildandholy if you want to join the Kickstarter campaign, or keep listening here. Whenever it is released and you can buy it elsewhere, I'll let you know that as well. But meanwhile, I send you much love for this journey. This journey of grief is the most challenging one that we face in our lifetimes. And so I have deep love and compassion for you. And thanks for listening to me as I ramble on and on. But I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts about the second wave of grief in hopes that whoever listens may find it helpful as well. So until next week, when I come back again, remember that we're here for the love, but we're also here for the grief. So face your fear, be ready for whatever life brings you next, and love each and every moment of your precious life. Bye-bye.